Burns.
It is perhaps my good fortune to again follow Hekia Parata as we speak on the appropriation debate and to note her comments about the importance of early childhood education when this is a budget that cuts early childhood education by $250 million. To hear her say that we cannot afford to spend more than we earn and therefore we should not be borrowing, when this is a budget which borrows the best part of $500 million for tax cuts, which are clearly unaffordable. To hear comments which says all of the commentators are applauding this as a brilliant budget. Well, I say you want to go back and reread the commentary of some of those who've been observing this budget, such as the Productive Economic Council, Burl, the Manufacturer and Exporters Association, and look at what their comments are about this budget. And I note that some of the previous speakers from the other side have been rural MPs talking about how this is a great budget for their electorates. Well, I want to ask how this is a great budget for a rural economy when the Minister's own statements to the House reflect the fact that we are going to see in the next year an increase, yes, in exports of 2.4%, but an increase in imports of 10.8%, leading to a blowout in the current account balance, which is actually the important measure of our wealth as a nation because it measures all of the expenditure that we incur as a nation and all of the costs that we incur as a nation, and we have not had a current account in balance since I was in shorts at school, and that's where we should be trying to head with this budget, and in fact we're going backwards. I note the comments from Amy Adams about all this awful expenditure, that really is wasteful. And I want to mention the call that I got from a rural constituent, not in my electorate of Christchurch Central, but from a Canterbury rural constituency, who asked in desperation, could I assist her because her home help has been cut from 3 visits a week to 2 visits a fortnight, and she has had 3 accidents on the farm or nearby and 1 road accident, and she is struggling to keep body and soul together, and those home help visits are the difference for her between a quality of life and no quality of life. And if you are going to describe that as wasteful, bloated expenditure, I think you need to think very, very seriously again. We had Bill English in front of the Finance and Expenditure Committee last Thursday, and this question was put to him about how this is going to stimulate the economy when we have tax cuts which are actually going to be, for those who can afford to have some discretionary income from the tax cuts, all of the signals are those people will now retire debt. So there's not going to be any stimulus or very much for the domestic economy, certainly not for discretionary spending like retail and restaurant sector. And we have, of course, exports flattening out, in part because the following Speaker at Finance and Expenditure was the Reserve Bank Governor Dr Ballard confirming a rise in the official cash rate, which feeds into higher interest rates, so the dollar rises with it. So therefore our productive sector, those who create the lifeblood for this economy, are certainly not being assisted by the budget's economic settings and what is flowing out of it. The reality is that this budget is not a good budget for the productive sector, for the rural sector, nor indeed for the urban sectors of New Zealand. Let me just comment briefly about the Prime Minister's comments today, that there may be funding found perhaps in this financial year for irrigation schemes in Canterbury. And I want to say, believe it or not, I'm a supporter of irrigation for Canterbury with this important caveat. We want to see irrigation in Canterbury, we want to see more greening of the plains, but we want to see it take place in a situation where the environmental outcomes improve alongside the economic outcomes. And when the Prime Minister is indicating and has said on the record that he wants to see new irrigation in place in Canterbury next year, there is no way on God's earth that that can be done alongside environmental improvements. And that's why we see the question today about the role of Wyatt Creech, who 18 months ago was actually being briefed about what was needed in Canterbury nearly 1 year before he took on his role reviewing Environment Canterbury, nearly 1 year before he took on the official role as an independent chair of an independent review. He was being briefed by the Minister of Agriculture's office about what was needed in Canterbury, and things flowed from there very, very obviously. This budget was a shocker for people in my electorate. More than 3 out of 4 people in my electorate of Christchurch Central earn less than $40,000 a year. And that's why I oppose the increase in GST provided by this budget, because simply it's a smokescreen. It is a smokescreen to allow a further tax cut for those on the top rates of pay. And they are going to benefit handsomely from those increases, while those who are on the very basic incomes will be getting virtually nothing by the time cost increases take their toll. We've had 12,000 job losses in my city of Christchurch in the last year. 12,000. There's very little in this budget to do anything about providing for training, to provide any stimulus for the economy in terms of job creation. Just in the last 24 hours, we've seen more than 100 more job losses announced looming at the meatworks on the outskirts of Christchurch. Where's the government's response to that? What's going to happen in respect of those people, their lives? What's coming from the budget to assist them and their families into their futures? 12,000 job losses in 1 year in Christchurch, 1,000 a month, nothing in this budget to provide for more job training. In fact, it's going backwards. The YMCA was until quite recently providing literacy training for 15 and 16-year-olds who basically were in last resort education. That funding has been lost, and it certainly has not been replaced in this budget. And I say that will leave a social legacy in my city that will be a long time coming in the effects it has on everybody else in our community. We're also seeing the situation of the nearly 50 early childhood centres in my electorate where mum and dads are simply going to have to pay more because of the cuts being provided. Perhaps $1 an hour or more having to be found out of some of those basic income families to provide for the childcare for them. And in the meantime, of course, other sectors of the community will be doing it hard as well. What we're seeing is actually a handful of personal tax being provided and then 2 handfuls coming back to the government by way of GST, higher early childhood fees, rising power prices and a number of other things as well. One other little gem in the budget, not given much focus yet, is a cut in the rates rebate funding. This is a scheme which Labor introduced to try and take some of the pressure off those who are at the bottom end of the income scale. Rates can be a big impost. Rates, of course, will be going up as a result of this budget. 2.5% at least will be going on the rates, and I'll comment about that further in a moment. But the provision of $58 million that was in the previous budget to provide for people who might take up the scheme, and only about 2 out of 3 do, has been reduced by this budget. And that simply means what we should be doing, in fact, is promoting the scheme and taking some of the pressure off lower income households. But in fact, that budget spending has been deleted by the budget of last month. My prediction is, in fact, that we will see a quite savage round of rates increases next year, because city councils, district councils, territorial authorities, of course, struck their rates before the budget really took effect. They will therefore have to take account of the year from October 1st through to the 1st of June next year, 30th of June next year, and then they'll have to take account of any inflationary impact driven by the GST increase for the following year as well. So I'm suggesting we will see some significant double-digit rate increases next year, flowing in large part out of the GST increase of this budget and a further impost upon the costs of low-income families. Comment about the Environmental Protection Agency, which missed out from this budget in terms of funding, which was a blow, I think, for the credibility of the Minister for the Environment, Nick Smith, who pledged last year that the Environmental Protection Authority would be up and running by the 1st of July this year. Now he's saying it should be up and running by the 1st of July next year. He's talking about 150 staff, but doesn't mention too much that 90 of those will be staff coming across from the Environmental Risk Management Authority, and many of the others will actually be employed and paid for in processing major resource consents. So I'd like to ask, where are the environmental protection staff of the new and coming Environmental Protection Agency? Because they're certainly not provided for in this budget. They're very, very much needed, especially if we're going to see new water growth across Canterbury and other regions, and it's another missing gap in this budget, one of very, very, very many indeed. It's a very poor budget. It is not a brilliant budget by any means.